this. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Wednesday. If you're online, sorry that we're a little bit late this morning. We had the fire alarm go off in the middle of class break, and that sort of disrupted everything, and we had to evacuate the building, and it was all very exciting. Yes, it was all very exciting. People were on the edge of their seats with anticipation. Nothing happened. There's no fire. What's the reason? We don't know. Could have been someone accidentally pulled the fire alarm. Maybe somebody was reheating their lunch in the microwave somewhere and it burned, and who knows. So I don't know. I thought they would have. I thought the fire department would have shut that off, but maybe they. Oh no. Okay. I'm sure it'll stop in a while. But yeah, everything is fine. Nothing happened. We all just went for a little walk. Fresh air. Okay. Let's jump into where we were yesterday. So, yes. I'd asked you to read a section of the text kind of detailing the latter half of World War II. And we heard about some of the more important battles. We heard about Stalingrad, in which the Nazis were trying to take over this center of weapons production, but also a city that was a kind of supply line for the Soviet Union from the other allies. And so the Nazis figured if they could cut the supply line, they could weaken the Soviet Union. But of course, we read that they didn't manage to do that. The Russians managed to encircle them, and eventually the Nazi soldiers are forced to surrender. And this is the first Nazi surrender in the entire war, which again, if you're cheering for the Allies, is good news. But this is like 1942, 1943, right? The war's been going on for 4 years, and finally the Nazis are experiencing defeat, right? So they've been on a winning streak for quite a while, right? We talked a little bit about El Alamein in northern Africa, in Egypt, a place where, again, the Allies are able to push the Nazis out of northern Africa. That's going to give them a little base to jump across to southern Europe and sort of enter and begin to push, well, first the Italians and then later the Nazis back into their own territory, right? So now we've kind of got, after El Alamein, we've got the Soviet Union. I should probably turn around because it's backwards. The Soviet Union coming in from the east. The Allies are now able to come in from the south. And then, of course, they're going to need to come from the west, right? And that'll be that D-Day operation along northern France, where they will land and then start to push Germany back from the west. So as we go into like 1944, we see that Germany's got a war on 3 fronts, right? They're fighting in the south, they're fighting in the east, and they're fighting now in the west. And of course, it's probably all over for them, right? As the Allies kind of close in and push the Nazis back into Germany. But of course, the Allies are prepared they're only going to stop the war if Germany surrenders unconditionally. And as long as Hitler's alive, Germany will never surrender, right? Fortunately, we know that he commits suicide, but we'll get to that in a second. We said there's a few important agreements that happen here at Casablanca and Tehran and Moscow and Yalta, right? And here at Casablanca, they decide to only accept Germany's unconditional surrender. In Tehran, they start to talk about these spheres of influence, right? And that's the point where Churchill kind of whispers to President Roosevelt from the US, and he said, hey, if we let the Soviet army into Eastern Europe, it might be dangerous. We might not be able to get the Soviets out of those countries. And Roosevelt said, oh, don't worry about that, Winston. We'll deal with that after the war, right? Which may or may not have been the right call, but either way, the Soviet armies are going to stay in Eastern Europe after the war. So Churchill is right to be concerned here. Here in Moscow, when Roosevelt is involved in an election, a presidential election in the United States, Churchill blah, blah. Oof. I'm just going to have a sip of coffee here, and maybe that will kind of straighten my mouth out so that I can speak. Churchill will meet with Stalin, and they'll kind of formally agree to these spheres of influence. Okay, so these areas of Europe that one side or the other side will have power over. Okay, and again, that's important because that'll be critical during the Cold War. And then finally at Yalta, Roosevelt is back, and they decide that the armies are going to come together basically halfway through Germany in the Elbe River, and that the Allies will, or the Western powers will have control of Western Germany, Soviet Union will have control of Eastern Germany, and Berlin will be divided into 4 pieces. And that's kind of weird, because if you look at the map on, we'll get to this later, but if you look at the map on page 133 of the text, you'll see that Berlin is going to be divided into 4 pieces, right? The US, France, Britain, and the Soviet Union. But Berlin is actually pretty far inside of the eastern half of Germany. So even though the Allies are going to have control of parts of Berlin, all of Berlin is inside of Soviet territory. So that's going to be a little uncomfortable, and it's going to create some issues later, but we'll deal with that. So here's this battle of Normandy, where the Allied forces land in northern France, and very quickly they manage to start pushing their way back into Europe, right? So they land here at about 4 or 5 beaches, they fight their way onto the beach, and then they manage to start pushing the Nazis out of France and back toward Germany. So you can see here that there's a lot of activity now in Europe, again, pushing the Nazis from the south, from the east, from the west, compressing them into Germany, and eventually the Allies will take all of Germany as well. It's kind of at this point that Hitler commits suicide. He sees that it's basically all over. As you can see here, a couple days earlier, Benito Mussolini had been executed by a firing squad, and so a mob of resistance fighters caught him and executed him publicly. And so Hitler probably saw that and thought, ugh, I don't think I want to go that way. And so he commits suicide on April 30th. He tells his next in command, fight to the end, right? Every last man, woman, and child for the fatherland. Never surrender. Right? But of course, a week later, they do surrender. Hitler's second in command realizes that it's over, right? They're being overrun by Allied and Soviet forces. It's done, right? They're finished. And so they issue their unconditional surrender on May 7th, and it's officially over. World War II is finished. Right? So this is kind of an important point, a historical endpoint. Of course, it's the end to a conflict that has been going on for 4 years, right? And if you extend back to 1933, when Hitler takes power, it's a good 11 years of the Hitler show, right? And so it's kind of nice to bring that to an end, right? 11 seasons of any show is a lot, and for the Hitler show, it's really too much, right? So they're able to bring that sort of chapter of history to an end. They're able to bring this conflict to an end, but it also is a time in which the international power structure is changing, okay? So prior to World War I, and maybe even prior to World War II, Europe was kind of the center of power, right? Britain, France, Germany, those were the big, powerful industrial countries. Those were the countries with money, with technology, and they dominated the planet, right? The British Empire it spanned the globe, right? They said things like the sun never sets on the British Empire, which in part meant that, they had countries all the way around the world under their control. But by the time we get to 1945, things have changed, right? Countries like Britain and France and Germany, they've been through two catastrophic wars with each other. They are broke. Millions and millions of their people have died. Massive infrastructure damage. They're crippled, right? Their economies have been crippled. Their countries have been crippled. And instead, new superpowers are going to step forward, right? And as you probably have guessed, those are going to be the United States, that is a very strong industrial power that really wasn't damaged at all by the war effort, both war efforts, and the Soviet Union, right? And we'll talk about the Soviet Union a little bit later, the idea that they actually start off quite weak, but Joseph Stalin here is going to make them an industrial superpower in basically no time at all. In about 10 or 15 years, he's going to take a kind of broken, backward country and turn it into a superpower. But we'll get to that. But anyway, we've kind of emerged at the end of World War II in a bipolar world, right? And I'm not talking about mental illness or anything. I'm talking about a world with two major powers that oppose each other, right? The Soviet Union and the United States. And Europe will kind of become, the point at which these two powers start to rub up against each other, right? In Germany and particularly in Berlin. This is where the USSR and the US are kind of next door neighbors, and there's going to be some friction between them. Okay, so what I'm going to ask you to do is to read a big chunk of the textbook. And Regina's looking at me like, oh God. But what I will try to sweeten the pot with is that, yes, we have to read this. Yes, we have some questions to answer. But once we're done, I have a movie to show you that's actually like a Hollywood movie that I think might be really interesting and exciting to kind of talk about. And so that will be your reward for all of this textbook reading. So does that make you feel a little better about textbook reading, or is there just nothing I could give you to make that, to lessen the sting of that? Is it okay? Or is it like, that's not a good enough bribe? No? Okay. Well, here's what we'll do. We'll read this section here of the textbook. It looks like kind of a lot, and it probably is. But as you'll see, it just has to do with the war in the Pacific. And we haven't really dealt with it too much. And I think in the interest of time, I'm not giving it a lot of airtime, right? And so some people may agree with that. Some people may disagree with it. But that's what I'm choosing to do. I'm giving the Pacific part of World War II less attention and the European part more. I don't know if that's good or not, but that's what we'll do, okay? So I'll let you start reading. And then we'll take a break and we'll come back and we'll read a bit more, okay? Is it as much as it looks like? It is as much as it looks like? Okay. That's okay. We'll get through it. We'll read part of it and then we'll take a break and then we'll read more. And then I'll show you a movie. Best I can do for you. Is that okay? Okay. All right. For those of you online, I'm just going to put this into Microsoft Teams so that you have it, and then we can begin. If Regina will stop having a temper tantrum over there. All right. rationing. 5 more minutes and then a break. Nobody's talking to me anymore. Oof. Hey, come on in, Ryan. Okay, would you like to take a little break? Yeah, let's take a little break, okay? Come back in 10. We'll keep going, okay? Okay. Just out of curiosity, Anna, what page are you on right now?
In just 145.
145. Okay. Regina, where are you?
147, 149.
Okay. Okay. Good to know. All right. Let us continue. Give you just another minute there, good people. And then we will talk. Okay, people. Let's try to answer some questions here about what this Pacific War thing was about. Because as you've kind of seen, and who has studied World War II before, and specifically the Pacific part of the war? Regina. Have you guys studied, Ryan? Have you guys studied the Pacific War previously in school? The Pacific part of World War II? Yeah. Yeah, so let's just answer this question. What's the cause of the Pacific War? We know that in Europe, the cause of World War II was pretty much Hitler, right? And his sort of plans for Germany, his desire for a new order. But how did the Pacific War start? Ryan, I'm going to start with you. How did the Pacific War start? Okay. What did they attack? Okay, well, for the United States, it definitely starts with Pearl Harbor, right? The United States is kind of minding its own business while also supplying Britain with all kinds of things, and then, yeah, we have Pearl Harbor, which kind of kicks it off. What are the Japanese trying to do by attacking the United States? What's that?
They are trying
Okay, they're trying to anger them. They definitely do, right? The U.S. is PO'd, right? Why would they want to anger? Why would they want to poke the bear? Why would they want to anger the United States? Seems like a silly thing to do, but why do they do it?
I think they want to show them the power.
Sorry, say again. They want to show them.
Yeah, power.
Okay. They want to. The Japanese want to demonstrate that they have power, right? Military capability. Okay. What else are they trying to do? I'm going to go to Anna for the rest of this one. So that's very true, right? Definitely for the Americans, the war starts with Pearl Harbor, and it does kind of get kicked off around that time. The Japanese are definitely trying to provoke the Americans, right, into responding, and that works. They might be trying to annoy them, which they definitely do. But what else is kind of going on for the Japanese there, Anna? What are they trying to do?
To drop the naval submarine so they could have like control of Southeast Asia.
Yeah, so I guess they have kind of they have imperial ambitions, right? They kind of want to build themselves a little empire, right? A little empire in the Pacific. What's kind of their greater plan? What are they in the process of trying to do? Yeah, they want to compete with the nations that have already industrialized, right? So let's say 1941, when Pearl Harbor happens, in 1941, the European countries like Britain and France and Germany have industrialized, the US has industrialized, the Soviet Union has industrialized, and Japan kind of wants to be part of that group, right? They want to be able to compete. But of course, the problem is they're kind of pretty far behind, right? A country like Britain started to industrialize in the 1870s, right? 1860s, 1870s. Here we are, I don't know, what are we now? 70 years later? A little bit late to the party, right? But still, their plan is to catch up. And if you're going to industrialize, what do you need? If you're going to have a bunch of, what's that? Yeah, you need raw materials, you need resources, right? You need minerals and metals and iron and coal and lumber. You need all of these things, rubber, right? You need all of these raw materials to start to manufacture. And unfortunately for Japan, Japan is a reasonably small island, right? And they don't really have any of that stuff there. And so what do they have to do? Well, they have to do the same thing that all those European powers did in the 1800s. They need to colonize, right? They need to leave their home and take over or get access to resources somewhere else. And where do they go? To where? I can't hear you. Yeah, they do take over a bunch of Southeast Asian places, but even in the late 1930s, where did they go to get their resources? Australia? No, not quite. Yeah. They go to China. They go to a place called Manchuria, which is kind of the northeastern portion of China, right? So they go up there and they take it over in an attempt to gain all of the raw materials. And there's lots of minerals and metals to be mined up there, and lumber. There's lots of materials that Japan can use to help it industrialize itself, right? And as you might imagine, very quickly they get into a conflict with the Chinese. Oh wow. They get into a conflict with the Chinese government, right? Because China doesn't want a Japanese invasion, right? So they're kind of fighting a war with China. We hear about Jiang Jieshi, who's head of the Kuomintang government at the time. They get into a little bit of a conflict, a little bit of a war, and Japan kind of wins, right? Or at least they win enough to kind of occupy Manchuria and start taking resources back out, right? So again, Japan is kind of in the process of doing what all of those European countries did 60 or 70 years ago. They're trying to industrialize, they're trying to gain access to resources with kind of colonization, and they're kind of fighting a war in order to do it, right? In order to build their empire. So yeah, like Ryan said, the Japanese strategy here is to fan out and attack a bunch of people really quick, take over what they can, and try to kind of fight long enough to negotiate some sort of a settlement. And I think that was Hitler's plan as well, right? He didn't think he was going to conquer all of his allies. He was just trying to fight long enough to get them to say, okay, time out, let's negotiate, right? Let's have a peace treaty. And so Hitler thought he would do that. He thought he would fight for a little while, and then people would call a timeout and they would negotiate, and he would try to get what he wanted. And it seems like Japanese leadership is the same way, right? They're going to attack the Americans, they're going to cause problems for them for a little while, and then they're hoping the Americans will say, okay, let's just stop this and talk it out, right? Let's come to some sort of an agreement. Of course, we know that's not going to happen. It's not going to go that way, but that's kind of initially their plan, because they know they can't beat the US, right? They know they can't. What's the significance of the Battle of Midway? David, help me out here. Why is the Battle of Midway an important one in the Pacific War? Let's look at, I'm just going to look at this map here that's on page 147. And wow, Midway is way out in the middle of nowhere, isn't it? It's an aptly named island because it's basically midway in the Pacific Ocean, probably between Japan and North America, right? So it's way out in the middle of nowhere. Why on earth would the Japanese want to take an island like this? Okay. Because the U.S. has significant military? They do not at the time. So the Japanese go there and they take it over first, right? And then the Americans have to try to get it back. But why did the Japanese want it in the first place? There's probably, it's a small island, there's probably nothing on it but snakes and rats. But why on earth would they take over this island? What do you think, Ryan?
They might be able to locate enemies' base.
Yeah, right. So this is so far out. It's kind of a forward base for radar, right? So if the Americans want to come and attack Japan either with planes or with ships, they're going to have to sail through the Pacific, right? And if you've got a big radar station on Midway Island pointed at the US, you're going to know about anyone coming at you very early, right? And so if the Japanese can keep Midway Island, they can have very advanced warning about any American ships or planes that might be coming over, right? And so, of course, for the same reason, maybe not for the same reason, but for that reason, the Americans want to take it over, right? Because they don't want the Japanese to have advance notice, right? Something happened earlier as a result of that Doolittle raid that was a big plus for the Americans. Did you catch what it was? A group of those bombers flew over Tokyo. They randomly bombed Tokyo. Didn't really, it did some damage and freaked a bunch of people out. Didn't really have any effect, but something important came out of it for the Americans. What was it? Regina's got it. No? Right. So all of the Japanese transmissions over the radio are encoded, right? They're encrypted, I guess is the proper word. They're in code. And so as a result of the Doolittle raid, there's so much communication going between Japan and they're in the airwaves that the Americans get lots of opportunity to see what these transmissions are, and they manage to break Japanese codes, right? And so again, there were no secure networks like there are nowadays, right? And so anyone could listen to your radio transmissions at the time, and so you had to encrypt them. You had to send them in code. But the Americans break that code, and now they can hear everything the Japanese are transmitting, right? They know they're listening in on their phone calls, if you will, reading their emails, but those things don't exist yet. So, Midway is a big deal. The Americans want to take it. The Japanese have it. Who kind of wins that battle? Yeah, right? The U.S. does succeed in taking back Midway. And the textbook describes the Americans kind of get a little bit lucky, right? Because the Japanese have their big aircraft carriers with their planes on top, and they're all refueling the planes. The Americans show up. Woohoo! They're all just sitting there, right, on the top of the aircraft carrier. And so the Americans can just come in and blow them all up. And so the Americans not only do they take Midway, but it's kind of a big win because they destroy a lot of Japanese planes and aircraft carriers at the same time. And so their strategy then, and you can kind of see it on page 147 there, you can see their strategy is to kind of island hop, right? They're going to go from Midway down into the Marshall Islands, Mariana Islands, to Iwo Jima, then to Okinawa. They're just going to keep bouncing from island to island, fighting the Japanese all the way until they can get close enough to Japan to get within striking distance, right? Which they do. The Americans are successful all the way through. Why is it that the Japanese are so successful at the beginning part of the Pacific War? The Americans are successful toward the end, but why were the Japanese so successful at the beginning? What do you think? Anna, what do you think? Kind of, yeah. So the Japanese kind of expected a bit of a response. They went out and attacked a bunch of places at the same time. They were able to bring a number of countries under control, but the U.S. and the Allies had already kind of agreed that they were going to deal with Europe first, right? So the Americans were kind of on the defensive. They were trying to keep the Japanese from going too far, but they weren't really attacking them and they weren't really stopping them, right? They were just kind of standing in the background, making sure they didn't go too far, right? But as we see here, after it looks like Europe is under control and the Nazis are surrendering, then the Americans kind of turn it on, right? They turn their attention to the Pacific, and they're like, okay, game on, right? And then they start pushing the Japanese basically from island to island all the way back to the mainland of Japan, right? Did I say 1, 2, 5, and 6? I said 1, 2, 5, and 6. Okay. What are the two options for trying to deal with Japan? So the Americans have been successful. They're all the way within striking distance of Japan. What are their two kind of choices to continue the war? Two strategies. Brian, what's one? Right? But with what kind of specific bomb? Which one? Yeah, right? So there's this brand new technology that's just been invented, brand new, atomic energy, right? And so we see that Roosevelt steps down, Harry Truman, the president, is elected. Roosevelt was a little bit of a softer guy. Harry Truman's a straight shooter, right? He's kind of a tough egg. And so, yeah, one of his options is this new super bomb that nobody else has that he can use, right? What's the other option? What's the other option to deal with Japan? Super bomb or what? Super bomb or Anna, do you have it there? No. The other, just because we're running out of time, I'll help you out here. The other option is just to simply invade. Okay, so just kind of like, you know, the Normandy landings, they'll come ashore, they'll kind of try to take the beach, and then they'll start moving inland, and they'll start to fight the Japanese on their own island, their own territory, right? So got these two options here, right? Both of them have pros, both of them have cons, but that's something that we'll talk about tomorrow. Okay, so we'll talk about the beginning of the atomic age, we'll talk about the decision to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki, talk about the end of the war, beginning of the Cold War, and then maybe we'll get to our film. Okay, because we worked hard today, right? Hard work, hard reading. Okay, that's all for today. You can pack it up. I'll see you tomorrow, and we'll do those things. Okay. All right.